Welcome to our channel. Here in this episode we will discuss about the situation of Central Asian Muslims under Russian Tsar. After the fall of Turco-Mongolian warrior Tamerlane, or Temur, the Muslims of Central Asia after the long period of nomadic factionalism and conflicts, eventually come under the rule of Russian Tsar. Virtually by the end of the 18th century, whole of Central Asia was under the control of Russian Tsar. For Russians, the major strategic reason to occupy the Central Asia was to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a British colony. The resulting imperial competition between Russia and Britain for gaining control over Afghan territory mounted to the degree that it brought about precarious international crises and eventually resulted into Anglo-Afghan wars in 1839 to 1842 and 1878 to 1880. On the other side, American Civil War 1861 to 1865 proved to be a serious setback to the Russian textile companies. Cotton imports from America decreased seriously, which by the middle of the 19th century led Russians for military campaigns in Central Asia, because what the Russians were looking for was the land on which they could cultivate cotton to supply the country's budding textile industry. South Central Asian fertile soil, noted since antiquity for high-quality cotton crops, was the only neighboring option that Russians annexed without much standing in their way. The fragile princes or chiefs of Shaybanid Khanate, who controlled most of South Central Asia, couldn't resist the Russian colonial force for any longer. Russian Tsar, having had succeeded in stretching their empire to northern fringes of Afghanistan, was now face to face with Britain to negotiate things. For Britain, having undergone 2 consecutive defeats, all they need was to finalize the borders of Afghanistan with an explicit undertaking relating to Russo-Afghan relations. That said, Russians were confident with the geostrategic advantage for the introduction of land taxation arrangements. Tsarist land policy in Central Asia meant large-scale expropriation of land for the resettlement of Russians into the region, whether as peasants or town dwellers. Altogether, more than 40 million hectares, comprising around 20% of the whole agricultural land, were confiscated, which gradually increased to the extent that the lands used for nomadic livestock herding shrunk markedly, while households were shorn of their winter and summer pastures. By 1917 there were 300 new settlements in agricultural lands of Central Asia, inhabiting around 2 million Russians and Ukrainians. Alongside this state of colonization, Tsarist administration granted settlers access to the agricultural lands of the region in order to cultivate valuable crops, especially cotton. Lands that were used to produce vegetables, fruits and grains were turned into cotton fields. Tsar's rule in Central Asia, though, received considerable resistance on the account of their policy of colonization, coercion, and confiscation of local resources was in certain domains positive for the region. Most of all, it connected Central Asian civilization with the new system of world links. The region witnessed establishments of networks of railway lines and main roads, industrial production and new means of communication, banking and credit system, etc. But for Russians all this was to the fulfillment of their main strategic task, turning Central Asia into Russia's cotton base, alongside another economic activity including wine and vodka making, spread out increasingly and became a source of huge profits for Russians. Nevertheless, seeing it as a serious attack on their religious practices, local populations, the majority of who were Muslims, were vastly dissatisfied with alcoholism, particularly about the spread of wine and alcohol addiction among local Central Asian youth. Such disappointments, together with confiscation of local resources such as lands, and the consequent falling living standards, led many Central Asians to perceive Russians' policy as an invasion not merely on socio-religious domain, rather on the mainstay of everyday life. There is an array of evidence to this stance. Among the circumstances that better explain the subsequent growth of open opposition and movements against the Tsarist regime included the growing contacts with outside world that led the intellectual ethos of Central Asian society to came under the heavy influence of the episodes and events that took place in the countries such as India, Turkey, Iran and Russia itself. The proclamation of the rights and freedoms of citizens in the Constitution of Turkey, 1876, the adoption of the law on local self-government in India, 1880, the constitutional movement in Iran, and the revolution in Russia were few important. Jadidism, generally known as modernism, was the major derivative in Central Asia that Russians by the turn of the century perceived as the greater threat. Jadids not merely emphasized the modernization of education, rather they strove for the strengthening of the national liberation movement. On their initiatives, certain socio-political organizations were formed and many journals and newspapers began to appear like Sado-i Turkestan, Voice of Turkestan, which helped spreading their ideas. While Russians went all their way to limit the influence of Pan-Turkic movement, the major resistance to the Jadidism, however, came from the Qazis, also known as Khadims or conservationists, the local religious elites, who advocated strict application of the Sharia. They, Khadims, not only cast doubt on the innovative ideas of Jadids, because it was a derivative of foreign influences, but they feared that these new ideas would risk their positions of leadership. Though Khadims, having had a mass appeal, couldn't limit the influence of Jadids to any greater extent, because by this time, discontent among Central Asians was rife. Farmers, who were deprived of their lands, the nomads left without grasslands and Jadids, all resented Tsarist rule. Indeed, Jadids, together with the rest fled to Mongolia and China or starved to death. According to some reports, over 1 lakh Muslims were put to death in Kyrgyzstan alone. However, very soon, this brutality happened to be the last assault by Russians on Central Asians, as in the beginning of 1917, the catastrophic adversity brought about by World War I caused massive upheavals in Russia and elsewhere. The Tsarist regime collapsed, and a new democratic government came into being. For some time, it seemed as if the starting decades of the 20th century had something good to offer to the people of Central Asia, but Russia's new government was suspended within few months, thereby opening new episode of political struggles. A new group of radical socialist revolutionaries, also called Bolsheviks, emerged, who by accepting no opposition, ruled out the possibility of negotiating the question of who should hold power, and thus made inevitable the forthcoming clash of forces in the political arena of the region. But, eventually, Bolsheviks by their military and political ascendancy gained the appeal, especially in rural Central Asia. Their utmost vision was to overhaul Russia entirely and build it as the world's first socialist society. Private property would be abolished and the entire economy would be controlled by the state. However, for Muslims, Soviet Union proved to be even more complex and threatening. That we will discuss in our next video. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe our channel at Extra Modern.